Hey everybody, day 12. Today I'm going to take some time to address one of the counter arguments that I constantly hear brought up when it comes to Black Lives Matter and why I shouldn't be wearing it or why it's a political thing or whatever it may be. Hopefully, this will turn into something that I'm able to do, every couple of weeks where I at least address one of these counter arguments to the movement and to the phrase Black Lives Matter. So, the one I want to start with today is well, what about black on black violence? If Black Lives Matter really cared about black lives, they would be tackling the crime rates in inner cities and, all the homicide rates there. All right, so first, whataboutism is a logical fallacy. It's an attempt to distract the audience or the argument itself from the issue that was brought up by shifting the focus into something else. So let's just right off the bat acknowledge that that's what that is. And it's a tactic that the current president seems to use a lot. Anytime anything's brought up, it's what about this or what about that? So first, when you're arguing, you need to address the argument, not try to distract it. So that aside, black on black violence is constantly brought up because of the FBI data that says that 90% of all murders of African Americans or black Americans comes from black individuals. And they use this to say, that's the real killer of people in inner cities. It's not the police, it's not, these other things. It's black people themselves are killing one another, and that's what should be the focus. So, what about that? Well, first, white on white violence is almost the same rate. 83% of white people are killed by white people. And as you go and look at that data, you start to realize people kill people that they know. The vast majority of murders committed are committed by somebody who was close to the victim. And so, with that piece of information and knowing that whites kill whites at higher rates and blacks kill blacks at higher rates and so on and so forth, then the conclusion is that we still live in an extremely segregated society. And that is not an argument that racism is done. That's an argument that racism persists in our country. So, we have to see that. We live in still segregated cities. Black people tend to live around black people, white people live around white people, Latinx live around Latinx, so on and so forth. And so, as you make those arguments that, well, what about this? Of course, black people kill black people at higher rates because they live around each other. That's where that's going to happen. And then the other issue that is often not brought up is poverty. Black people in impoverished areas kill black people at about the same rate that white people in impoverished areas kill white people. So, trying to make the argument that, well, it's they're killing themselves. Well, any group that is segregated and is in impoverished conditions has similar murder rates across the country and in different areas all across the United States and across the globe. So ultimately, we have to realize that the issue of black on black crime or murder is not a fault of the race, right? Of black people as a collective in our nation. It's not some moral shortcoming of being black. It's not some cultural thing of what they teach their children or anything like that. Any of those pseudo-racist arguments that are brought up. It ultimately is because of the impoverished conditions and the segregated conditions that they find themselves in. Now, I also want to point out that this is very much an attempt to try to paint black people or African Americans as inherently more violent or more prone to crime or murder than other people. And that is simply false. So stop doing it. Like, if you're going to use the black on black argument, black on black crime argument, please just understand that it is racist. It's coming. That is a racist argument. You're either trying to make the argument that they're inherently more likely to commit a crime, inherently more violent, or there's some cultural failing. All of which is attributing that to an entire group of people, which is ultimately racist. So stop doing it. And then also, just so we're aware, Black Lives Matter as a group and as a phrase came about to protest the injustice of state violence against black people. when black people murder black people, they can be convicted. In fact, we know that African Americans in our criminal justice system are convicted at far higher rates than any other race, followed behind by Latino males. And so if they're getting convicted, that's not an issue of justice. And that's what Black Lives Matter is about, is justice. And the idea that cops can indiscriminately kill a black individual and no consequences will come about that. When if somebody were to murder my family, I know that if there's enough evidence and if they get caught, we will find justice. And yet in many of these cases where there is evidence and there's eyewitness testimony, they still get off and they're allowed to continue policing. And so that's what Black Lives Matter is about the injustice of state-sanctioned killing of black and brown men and women, not about just death in general, right? Otherwise, if all the people who want to scream all lives matter, which I'll have to cover in another episode, you would have to be more concerned. You could never talk about anything except heart disease and alcoholism and suicide, because those things kill people at far higher rates in the United States than anything else, far more than terrorism. So why are we spending so much money to fight terrorism when we really should be spending money to fight heart disease, since that's what's killing Americans at the highest rates? So just be genuine when you're making these arguments, and if you're just repeating something that you've heard somewhere else without thinking about it, please look into it and check it out before you make an ignorant comment on somebody's post or on somebody's thread. Just think before you write, think before you speak, and try to hear other people's perspectives. So see you next time.